Sophia Muller met Jonas Schneider on a rainy Tuesday evening in Frankfurt, inside a crowded bookstore where she ducked in to escape the downpour. He was standing in the philosophy section, holding a worn copy of Nietzsche, and when their eyes met over the shelves, something shifted in the air between them. Jonas was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes that seemed to see straight through to her thoughts. When he smiled and asked if she'd read the book in his hands, Sophia felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She was 32 years old, a successful architect who'd built her career from nothing after losing both parents in a car accident when she was 25. The insurance settlement and inheritance had left her financially comfortable, with a modest apartment in Frankfurt and a growing portfolio of commercial design projects. Her friends often joked that Sophia was married to her work, that she'd never let anyone close enough to matter. They weren't entirely wrong. After watching her parents' car get struck by a drunk driver on the Autobahn, after identifying their bodies at the morgue, after selling the family home because she couldn't bear to walk through rooms that still smelled like her mother's perfume, Sophia had learned that loving people meant risking unbearable loss. Jonas changed that calculation. Over the next 6 months, he pursued her with a patience that felt like genuine care. He showed up at her office with coffee when she was working late on deadline. He remembered the small details she mentioned in passing, like her favorite flower being white roses or how she preferred Italian films to American ones. He listened when she talked about her parents, about the grief that still caught her off guard sometimes, and he didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just sat with her in the sadness until it passed. By month 4, Sophia had introduced Jonas to her closest friends, including her best friend Clara Wagner, who worked as a lawyer in Frankfurt's financial district. Clara was cautious by nature and by profession, trained to spot inconsistencies and ask difficult questions. After their first dinner together, Clara pulled Sophia aside and said carefully that Jonas seemed wonderful, but perhaps things were moving quickly, that Sophia should take her time. Sophia laughed off the concern, explaining that when you'd lost as much as she had, you learned not to waste time when something felt right. Jonas proposed in December during a weekend trip to the Black Forest, going down on one knee in fresh snow with a diamond ring that must have cost 3 months of his salary as a financial consultant. Sophia cried and said yes, overwhelmed by the feeling that she'd finally found someone who understood her completely, who wanted to build a life together, who made her believe in permanence again after years of feeling untethered. They planned the wedding for March, just 3 months away. Sophia wanted something intimate and special, something that felt like the beginning of their shared adventure. Jonas suggested Dubai, painting a picture of getting married with desert views and Arabian Gulf sunsets, of starting their marriage somewhere exotic and unforgettable. Sophia hesitated initially, concerned about the expense, but Jonas insisted he'd been saving for years and wanted to give her the wedding she deserved. The guest list was small by design, just 14 people, including Sophia's closest friends and Jonas's mother. Marguerite Schneider, a quiet woman in her 60s who seemed perpetually worried about something unnamed. Clara made the trip despite expressing reservations about destination weddings being impractical. She arrived in Dubai 3 days before the ceremony and immediately noticed things that troubled her. Small inconsistencies in Jonas's stories about his work, the way he deflected questions about his family beyond his mother, how he became irritable when Sophia mentioned specific wedding costs. The wedding took place on March 15th at a luxury hotel overlooking the Palm Jumeirah. The ceremony was elegant and understated, conducted by an officiant authorized to perform Western weddings in the UAE, with Sophia wearing a simple silk gown and Jonas in a tailored navy suit. The photographs captured what appeared to be genuine happiness, Sophia laughing as Jonas whispered something in her ear during the reception, both of them dancing to a German song that had played at her parents' wedding decades earlier. Clara watched Jonas throughout the evening and couldn't shake her unease. She noticed how he'd disappeared for nearly 40 minutes during the reception, claiming he needed to take an important work call despite it being a Saturday night. She saw him checking his phone constantly with an expression that didn't match someone celebrating his wedding day. Most disturbing was a brief exchange she witnessed between Jonas and his mother, where Margaret grabbed his arm and said something urgently in German that made Jonas pull away sharply and walk off without responding. The reception ended around 11 p.m., with guests heading to their rooms and the newlyweds retiring to their honeymoon suite on the 23rd floor. The suite was extravagant, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Dubai's glittering skyline. a marble bathroom larger than most apartments, and a terrace with a private hot tub. Jonas had ordered champagne and strawberries to be waiting for them, another gesture that seemed romantic on the surface. Sophia felt exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day, from smiling for photographs and making small talk with guests and trying to be gracious, while her mind kept drifting to thoughts of her parents, wishing they could have been there to see her finally happy again. Jonas suggested she'd take a bath to relax while he handled some last-minute details with hotel staff. Sophia agreed gratefully, soaking in the enormous tub with bath salts the hotel had provided, letting the hot water ease the tension in her shoulders. When she emerged 40 minutes later in the hotel robe, Jonas had prepared a late dinner he'd ordered from room service. Pasta carbonara, her favorite, with a side salad and fresh bread. He'd opened the champagne and poured 2 glasses, insisting they toast to their future together. Sophia raised her glass and smiled, touched by the effort he'd made to create this romantic moment. They ate slowly, talking about the ceremony and laughing about small mishaps during the reception. Jonas kept refilling her champagne glass whenever it dropped below half full, encouraging her to relax and enjoy herself. By 1 a.m., Sophia was feeling pleasantly tired and slightly dizzy from the champagne and the long day. Jonas suggested they step out onto the terrace to see the city lights one last time before bed. The March night air was warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from somewhere below. Sophia leaned against the railing, looking out at the impossible geometry of Dubai's architecture, at the Burj Khalifa piercing the night sky in the distance. She didn't notice Jonas watching her with an expression that would later be described by witnesses as eerily detached. Didn't notice him checking the time on his phone. Didn't notice how he positioned himself between her and the suite door. What she did notice, about 20 minutes later, was a sudden wave of nausea so intense she had to grip the railing to stay upright. Her vision blurred at the edges and her skin felt simultaneously hot and cold. "Jonas?" she managed to say, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "Something's wrong. I don't feel right." Jonas turned to look at her, and his face showed concern, but something about it felt performative, like he was remembering to react rather than reacting naturally. "You probably just had too much champagne," he said calmly. "Let's get you inside and you can lie down." But Sophia's symptoms escalated rapidly over the next hour. The nausea gave way to violent vomiting that left her weak and trembling. Severe abdominal cramps followed, pain so intense she couldn't stand upright. By 3 a.m., barely 24 hours after they'd exchanged vows, Sophia was on the bathroom floor, unable to move, her body shutting down in ways she couldn't understand, while Jonas stood in the doorway watching her suffer with an expression that never quite matched the gravity of what was unfolding. Sophia's condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. By 4 a.m., she'd vomited everything in her stomach and was now retching bile, her body convulsing with contractions that left her gasping for air. The pain radiating through her abdomen felt like fire spreading through her organs, unlike anything she'd experienced before. When she tried to speak, to beg Jonas to call for help, her words came out slurred and incomprehensible. Jonas finally called the hotel front desk at 4:30, nearly 2 hours after Sophia's symptoms began. His voice on the recorded call was remarkably calm, almost casual, as he explained that his wife wasn't feeling well and might need medical attention. The desk agent, hearing something in the background that sounded like distress, immediately dispatched hotel security and contacted Dubai's emergency services. Paramedics arrived at 4:52 a.m. to find Sophia barely conscious on the marble bathroom floor, her skin clammy and pale, her pulse weak and rapid. Jonas stood near the bedroom door, dressed and composed, explaining that his wife had drunk too much champagne at their wedding reception and must be having a bad reaction. The lead paramedic, Ahmed Hassan, a veteran with 15 years of experience, took one look at Sophia's condition and knew this wasn't alcohol poisoning. Her pupils were constricted to pinpoints, her breathing was shallow and labored, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. They loaded Sophia onto a stretcher and rushed her to Rashid Hospital, one of Dubai's premier medical facilities equipped to handle critical emergencies. Jonas rode in the ambulance, sitting quietly in the corner while paramedics worked to stabilize his wife's vital signs. Ahmed noticed that Jonas never once reached out to hold Sophia's hand, never asked questions about her prognosis, never displayed the panic or fear typical of spouses watching their partners fight for life. "Doctor, Rashid Al Maktoum, the emergency physician on duty, met them at the entrance. Sophia was immediately transferred to a trauma bay where a team began aggressive treatment for what they initially suspected was severe food poisoning or allergic reaction. Blood tests were ordered, 4 fluids started, anti-nausea medications administered. Jonas stood outside the treatment area, filling out paperwork with steady hands, providing Sophia's information in a monotone voice that never wavered. Clara received the call at 6:15 a.m. She'd barely slept, troubled by the unease she'd felt throughout the wedding, and when her phone rang displaying Jonas's number, her stomach dropped before she even answered. Jonas told her Sophia was in the hospital, that she'd gotten sick during the night, that Clara should probably come. His tone suggested he was reporting a minor inconvenience rather than a medical emergency. Clara arrived at Rashid Hospital within 30 minutes, finding Jonas in the waiting area scrolling through his phone. When she demanded to know what happened, Jonas repeated his story about too much champagne and a possible allergic reaction. Clara pushed for details about when symptoms started, what Sophia had eaten or drunk, whether she'd taken any medications. Jonas's answers were vague and inconsistent, claiming he couldn't remember exact times, that everything happened so fast, though his calm demeanor contradicted the chaos he described. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Al Maktoum was growing increasingly concerned. Sophia's liver enzymes were elevated far beyond what food poisoning would cause. Her kidney function was declining rapidly. Her blood showed signs of systemic toxicity, but initial screens for common poisons came back negative. The pattern of organ failure was unusual, aggressive, and didn't match standard presentations they typically encountered. By 9 a.m., Sophia had slipped into unconscious shock. Her blood pressure required multiple vasopressor medications to maintain at barely adequate levels. Her kidneys had essentially stopped functioning. Most alarmingly, her extremities were showing signs of poor circulation, her hands and feet becoming cold and mottled, despite aggressive warming measures. Dr. Al Maktoum called for a consultation with Dr. Fatima Mansur, the hospital's toxicology specialist. Dr. Mansur reviewed Sophia's labs and clinical presentation with growing suspicion. The rapid multi-organ failure, the vascular collapse, the timeline of symptom onset all pointed toward toxic exposure rather than infection or allergic reaction. She ordered an expanded toxicology panel that included rare organic compounds and plant-based toxins not typically screened in standard emergency protocols. Clara stood outside the intensive care unit where Sophia had been moved, watching through the window as machines breathed for her friend, as monitors tracked vital signs that were failing despite maximal medical intervention. Jonas sat in a chair nearby, not watching, not crying, just waiting with an expression Clara would later describe as expectant rather than devastated. Something was profoundly wrong, and it had nothing to do with champagne or wedding stress. Clara's legal training kicked in, her mind cataloging inconsistencies and red flags. She approached Jonas and asked directly why he'd waited 2 hours to call for help. Jonas stumbled through an explanation about thinking Sophia just needed to sleep it off, about not wanting to overreact. Clara's next question cut deeper. Had Jonas given Sophia anything to eat or drink that evening besides what they'd shared? Jonas's face flickered with something Clara couldn't quite identify before settling back into concerned husband mode. Just the champagne and dinner, he insisted. Everything from room service. We ate the same things. But Clara had been a lawyer long enough to recognize when someone was lying. And Jonas Schneider was definitely lying. The toxicology results arrived at 2 p.m. on March 16th, 34 hours after Sophia had exchanged wedding vows with Jonas. Dr. Fatima Mansur stared at her computer screen for a full minute, rereading the findings to ensure she hadn't misinterpreted the data. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Al Maktoum with urgency that bypassed normal hospital protocols. Amatoxin, she said without preamble. High levels consistent with deliberate ingestion of death cap mushroom toxin. This wasn't food poisoning or an allergic reaction. Your patient was poisoned. Dr. Al Maktoum felt his blood run cold. Amatoxin poisoning was rare in Dubai, almost unheard of in their patient population. The death cap mushroom didn't grow naturally in the UAE's desert climate, and the toxin wasn't something one accidentally encountered. Someone had to obtain it deliberately, had to administer it knowingly, had to understand exactly what it would do to the human body. Under Dubai law, Suspected poisoning cases required immediate notification to authorities. Dr. Ol Maktoum contacted Dubai police within minutes, speaking directly with Lieutenant Khalid Roman from the Criminal Investigation Department. Roman listened to the medical summary and told the doctor not to inform anyone about the toxicology results until police arrived. He wanted to observe the husband's behavior without him knowing they'd identified the poison. Meanwhile, Sophia's condition had reached a critical threshold. The amatoxin had devastated her liver and kidneys beyond the point where those organs could recover without transplant. But the most immediate crisis was vascular, her circulation failing so catastrophically that blood flow to her extremities had essentially ceased. Dr. Ol Maktoum assembled a medical team including vascular surgeons to assess whether anything could be done to save her hands and feet. The vascular surgeon, Dr. Omar Patel, examined Sophia's limbs with growing dismay. The tissue in her hands below the wrists and her legs below the knees had already begun necrotizing, dying from lack of blood supply. The damage was irreversible and would soon become gangrenous if not addressed surgically. He stepped out of the ICU and found Clara in the waiting area, needing to have a conversation no doctor wants to have with a patient's family. "Your friend's circulation has failed," Dr. Patel explained gently. "The toxin in her system caused massive vascular collapse. Her hands and lower legs are dying. If we don't amputate, the dead tissue will become infected and she'll die from sepsis within days. We need consent to proceed with emergency surgery." Clara felt the room tilt. "Amputate? Both hands? Both legs?" Dr. Patel nodded gravely. "I'm sorry. There's no other option if we want to save her life. The surgery needs to happen within the next few hours." Clara turned to Jonas, who'd been sitting quietly throughout this conversation. His face showed appropriate shock, appropriate horror, but something about his body language felt rehearsed. He asked clinical questions about the procedure, about recovery time, about prosthetics, but never once broke down or demanded to know how this could have happened to his wife of barely 1 day. Clara made a decision in that moment. She told Dr. Patel she'd sign as Sophia's medical proxy, having been designated as such years ago when they'd updated their legal documents. She'd authorized the surgery. But first she pulled Dr. Patel aside and asked directly what had caused this vascular collapse. The doctor hesitated, bound by patient confidentiality and police instructions. But Clara's legal training gave her tools to ask questions that required honest answers. "Was this natural causes?" Clara pressed. "Or was my friend poised?" Dr. Patel's face confirmed what his words couldn't. Clara felt rage and horror wash over her in equal measure. She looked back at Jonas, who was now on his phone typing rapidly, and understood with sudden clarity that the man Sophia had married was the same man who'd destroyed her body. Lieutenant Roman arrived at the hospital at 3 p.m. with 2 additional officers. They found Jonas in the cafeteria, away from the ICU, drinking coffee and making phone calls. Roman introduced himself and asked if Jonas would be willing to answer some questions about his wife's illness. Jonas agreed readily, too readily, following the officers to a private consultation room the hospital had provided. The interview started with basic questions establishing timeline and facts. Jonas repeated his story about champagne and room service dinner, about Sophia getting sick around 1 a.m., about him calling for help when her symptoms worsened. Roman let him talk, taking careful notes, watching body language and micro-expressions that didn't align with the narrative Jonas was constructing. Then Roman changed tactics. "Mr. Schneider, we've identified what poisoned your wife. Amatoxin from death cap mushrooms. This toxin doesn't occur naturally in Dubai. Someone had to bring it here deliberately and administer it knowingly. Do you have any idea how your wife could have been exposed to this specific poison on your wedding night?" Jonas's face went carefully blank. He shook his head slowly, claiming ignorance, suggesting perhaps something in the hotel food had been contaminated. Roman let the silence stretch, an interrogation technique designed to make guilty parties uncomfortable enough to fill the void with explanations that reveal more than they intend. Jonas held the silence longer than most innocent people would. When he finally spoke, he asked if he needed a lawyer. Roman smiled thinly and said that was certainly his right, though it was an interesting question for someone who claimed to have no knowledge of how his wife got poisoned. The surgery began at 5 p.m. Dr. Patel and his team worked for 7 hours, removing both of Sophia's hands at mid-forearm level and both legs below the knee, trying to preserve as much viable tissue as possible while eliminating everything the poison had destroyed. Clara sat in the surgical waiting area, unable to cry, unable to process, just numb. Jonas never came to the waiting area. Roman had taken him to police headquarters for formal questioning. Dubai Police Headquarters occupied a modern glass tower in Dara, its interrogation rooms equipped with recording systems that captured every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that might reveal truth beneath practiced lies. Jonas Schneider sat across from Lieutenant Khalid Rahman in one such room. His posture relaxed, despite the gravity of the situation, his responses measured and careful. Roman had conducted hundreds of interrogations throughout his career, had learned to distinguish between innocent confusion and calculated deception. Jonas exhibited all the markers of the latter, answering questions with just enough detail to seem cooperative while avoiding specifics that might contradict other statements. When pressed about his relationship with Sophia, Jonas described a loving marriage, though his word choices revealed emotional distance rather than genuine affection. "Tell me about your finances," Roman said, shifting topics abruptly. "Were you experiencing any financial difficulties before the wedding?" Jonas's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Nothing unusual. Normal expenses." The wedding was costly but manageable. Roman pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid a document across the table. "We obtained a warrant for your German banking records. You have 47,000 euros in debt across 6 credit cards. Your consulting income barely covers minimum payments. 3 collection agencies have filed claims against you in Frankfurt courts." Jonas stared at the papers, his carefully maintained composure cracking slightly. "That's private financial information. You have no right to." "We have every right when investigating attempted murder," Rahman interrupted. "We also found something interesting, a life insurance policy on Sophia Muller. 1.2 million euros. Purchased 5 months ago. You're listed as sole beneficiary." The room went silent. Jonas opened his mouth, closed it, then tried to construct an explanation about responsible financial planning, about protecting each other. But the timeline betrayed him. He'd purchased massive insurance on Sophia while hiding catastrophic debt, while planning a wedding he couldn't afford, while researching methods to kill someone and make it look natural. Rahman's next revelation came from Jonas's laptop, seized from the hotel suite with a warrant. Forensic analysts had recovered deleted browsing history spanning 3 months. Searches for amatoxin toxicity, symptoms of mushroom poisoning, how long death cap poison takes to kill, whether toxicology screens detect amatoxin, and most damning, where to buy death cap mushrooms in Germany. Jonas tried to explain the searches as academic curiosity, research for a novel he was writing. Roman didn't bother responding to the obvious lie. Instead, he produced surveillance footage from a specialty botanical shop in Munich. The video, dated February 18th, showed Jonas purchasing dried death cap mushroom powder, signing a liability waiver that explicitly stated the product's toxic properties, paying in cash to avoid electronic records. The shop owner, when contacted by German authorities cooperating with Dubai police, identified Jonas from photographs and confirmed the purchase. He'd kept meticulous records because selling such substances required legal documentation. Jonas had claimed he needed the powder for toxicological research, a lie the shop owner had accepted at face value. Roman laid out the evidence systematically. The debt that gave Jonas motive. The insurance policy that quantified exactly how much Sophia's death was worth to him. The internet searches proving premeditation. The purchase of the specific poison found in Sophia's bloodstream. The timeline showing Jonas had bought the toxin 3 weeks before the wedding, had transported it to Dubai, had waited for the perfect moment when Sophia was alone and vulnerable in their honeymoon suite. "What we don't have yet," Roman said, leaning forward, "is the exact moment you administered the poison, but we will. We've seized the champagne bottle from your suite, the food containers from room service, every glass and dish. Forensic teams are processing everything. We're also examining your luggage, your clothing, any container that could have held the powder." Jonas said nothing, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Roman continued, "Here's what I believe happened. You prepared a drink for your wife, something only she consumed. You added the mushroom powder, knowing the symptoms wouldn't appear for several hours. You waited, watching her suffer, timing your call for help to ensure maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. You thought this would look like tragic food poisoning, that you'd collect the insurance and walk away wealthy." Jonas finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I want a lawyer. Raman nodded. That's your right. But understand this, Mr. Schneider. Your wife survived. She'll never hold anything in her hands again. She'll never walk normally again. But she survived, which means this is attempted murder, not murder. And when she wakes up, she'll tell us exactly what happened in that suite. Jonas was formally arrested at 9 p.m. and transferred to Dubai Central Jail. Under UAE law, he'd remain detained throughout the investigation and trial. No bail for attempted murder cases involving foreign nationals considered flight risks. Clara received the news at the hospital where Sophia remained in intensive care following the amputation surgeries. The operations had been technically successful, but Sophia's overall prognosis remained uncertain. Her liver and kidney damage was severe, potentially requiring transplants. The psychological trauma of waking up without hands or feet would require intensive therapy, assuming she survived at all. Clara sat beside Sophia's bed, holding vigil while machines monitored every vital function, while 4 pumps delivered medications to keep her alive. She thought about how Sophia had glowed with happiness just 48 hours earlier, how she'd finally let herself believe in permanence and safety after years of grief and caution, how Jonas had exploited that trust, had seen her vulnerability as opportunity, had literally tried to poison her to death within 24 hours of promising to love and cherish her forever. Sophia regained consciousness on March 21st, 6 days after her wedding. In a private room at Rashid Hospital, surrounded by machines that beeped rhythmically and 4 poles that delivered medications, keeping her organs functioning. The first thing she tried to do was brush hair from her face, an automatic gesture, but her arm didn't respond the way her brain commanded. She tried again, confusion giving way to panic as she looked down and saw bandaged stumps where her hands should have been. The scream that tore from her throat brought nurses running. Clara, who'd been maintaining constant vigil, rushed from the hallway where she'd been speaking with doctors. Sophia's eyes were wild with terror and disbelief, her body thrashing against the restraints medical staff had placed to prevent her from injuring herself during unconscious movements. A sedative was administered quickly, but not before Sophia had seen enough. Not before reality crashed through her consciousness with devastating clarity. Her hands were gone. When she looked further down, she saw more bandages, understood with horrifying certainty that her legs had been taken too. Dr. Al-Maktoum waited until Sophia was calm enough to process information before explaining what had happened. He spoke gently about the poison, about the vascular collapse, about the impossible choice between amputation and death. Sophia listened with tears streaming down her face, her mind struggling to connect the man who'd promised forever with the man who'd tried to kill her. Clara held Sophia's shoulder carefully, the only comfort she could offer that didn't require hands to reciprocate. When Dr. Al-Maktoum finished his medical explanation and left them alone, Clara delivered the harder truth. Jonas had been arrested. Evidence proved he'd poisoned Sophia deliberately on their wedding night. The insurance policy, the debt, the premeditated purchase of toxin weeks before their marriage. All of it pointed to calculated murder disguised as tragic honeymoon illness. Sophia's grief was layered and complex, mourning not just her lost limbs, but the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her marriage, her judgment, her future. The man she'd trusted completely had seen her as nothing more than a financial problem with a profitable solution. He'd waited until she was legally bound to him, until they were alone in a foreign country, until she'd let her guard down entirely before administering poison he'd carried thousands of miles specifically to kill her. Lieutenant Rahman visited Sophia's hospital room on March 23rd, bringing with him the final pieces of evidence that confirmed exactly how Jonas had executed his plan. Forensic analysis of the honeymoon suite had revealed trace amounts of amatoxin in a champagne flute, one that matched Sophia's fingerprints, but not Jonas's. He'd prepared her glass separately, adding the mushroom powder to champagne he'd poured only for her while pretending to share a romantic moment. The powder container itself had been found in Jonas's luggage, hidden inside a contact lens case, with residue still present. Jonas had been methodical, had planned every detail except the possibility that Sophia might survive long enough for doctors to identify the specific poison used. Roman needed Sophia's testimony to build the strongest possible case. She provided every detail she could remember about that night, about Jonas insisting she'd drink more champagne, about how he'd refilled her glass repeatedly while barely touching his own. about the strange expression on his face when she'd started feeling ill, something that looked almost like satisfaction rather than concern. The investigation also uncovered Jonas's connection to a woman named Kristen Hoffman in Frankfurt. Phone records showed they'd been in frequent contact throughout Jonas and Sophia's relationship. Kristen had known Jonas was engaged, had known about the wedding plans, had continued the affair while Jonas prepared to murder his bride. Text messages between them discussed Jonas's financial problems and cryptically referenced big changes coming soon that would solve everything. When German police interviewed Kristen, she initially claimed ignorance about Jonas's intentions, but presented with evidence of the insurance policy and her own messages asking when Jonas would finally be free. She admitted they'd planned a future together funded by what she'd believed would be Sophia's accidental death. She insisted Jonas had told her Sophia was terminally ill and had agreed to the insurance arrangement. A lie so transparent it collapsed under minimal questioning. Dubai prosecutors formally charged Jonas on March 28 with attempted murder, fraud, and transportation of prohibited toxic substances. Under UAE law, attempted murder carried potential life imprisonment. The evidence was overwhelming, the prosecution's case airtight. Jonas's attorney, a local lawyer appointed after Jonas couldn't afford private representation, advised him to accept a plea agreement that might reduce his sentence. Jonas refused. In a decision his lawyer called catastrophically stupid, Jonas insisted on proceeding to trial, apparently believing he could convince a court that Sophia had somehow poisoned herself or that the evidence had been planted. His delusion ran so deep he seemed incapable of accepting that his perfect plan had failed at every level. Sophia began the long process of physical rehabilitation and psychological therapy. Learning to function without hands required retraining her entire approach to daily activities. Prosthetic limbs would eventually provide some functionality, but the adjustment period was measured in years, not months. The emotional trauma went deeper than physical loss. Every morning brought fresh realization that the person she'd loved most had tried to murder her within hours of their wedding vows. Clara took extended leave from her law firm to stay in Dubai, managing Sophia's medical care and coordinating with prosecutors preparing for trial. She also dealt with the logistical nightmare of canceling the honeymoon arrangements, notifying friends and family about what had happened, fielding media inquiries as the case gained international attention. The story had everything journalists craved: romance turned to horror, exotic location, wealthy victim, calculating predator. Through all of it, Clara watched her best friend fight to survive, not just physically but emotionally. Watched Sophia struggle with suicidal thoughts that medical staff monitored constantly. Some days Sophia wished Jonas had succeeded, that she'd died in the hotel suite rather than face life as a quadruple amputee betrayed by the man she'd married. Clara sat with her through those dark hours, reminding her that survival itself was revenge, that watching Jonas's face justice required Sophia to be alive to see it. The trial of Jonas Schneider began on June 3rd in Dubai criminal court, 3 months after he'd poisoned his wife on their wedding night. The courtroom was packed with international media, curious observers, and legal professionals interested in what had become one of the most notorious poisoning cases in UAE history. Jonas sat beside his court-appointed attorney, looking thinner than in wedding photographs, his face carefully arranged in an expression meant to convey innocence betrayed by exhausted eyes that suggested sleepless nights in Dubai Central Jail. The prosecution presented their case methodically over 4 days, financial records showing Jonas's desperate debt situation and the massive insurance policy purchased 5 months before the wedding. Internet search history documenting his research into amatoxins and death cap mushroom poisoning. Surveillance footage from the Munich botanical shop showing Jonas purchasing the exact toxin found in Sophia's bloodstream. Forensic evidence from the champagne flute proving deliberate poisoning. Text messages with Kristen Hoffman revealing his plan for a future funded by Sophia's death. Each piece of evidence built an undeniable narrative of premeditated attempted murder. Jonas's defense attorney tried arguing coincidence and misunderstanding, suggesting the searches were innocent research, that the toxin purchase was for legitimate purposes Jonas had forgotten about, that someone else must have administered the poison at the hotel. The arguments were weak and the evidence overwhelming. On June 7th, Sophia testified via video link from her rehabilitation facility in Frankfurt, where she'd been transferred once medically stable. The courtroom fell silent as her image appeared on screens, as observers saw for the first time the full extent of what Jonas's poison had cost her. Sophia wore a simple blouse with shortened sleeves that didn't hide her prosthetic arms, mechanical hands resting on the table before her. She spoke clearly, despite obvious emotional difficulty, describing their relationship. The wedding, Jonas insisting she drink champagne he'd poured specifically for her. The horrific symptoms that began hours later, waking up in the hospital to discover her hands and legs were gone. When the prosecutor asked how she felt learning her husband had deliberately poisoned her, Sophia's voice broke, but she pushed through. I trusted him completely. I'd lost my parents and spent years afraid to love anyone because loss hurt so much. Jonas made me believe I was safe, that he wanted to build a life together. Instead, he tried to murder me within 24 hours of our wedding vows, so he could collect insurance money and start over with his mistress. Every morning I wake up without hands, I'm reminded that someone I loved saw my death as a financial opportunity. Jonas's attorney attempted gentle cross-examination, trying to suggest Sophia might be confused about details given her trauma. Sophia looked directly into the camera and said, "I am not confused about being poisoned by my husband. I'm not confused about him waiting while I suffered before calling for help. I'm not confused about spending the rest of my life learning to function with prosthetic limbs, because the man who promised to cherish me decided I was worth more dead than alive." The defense had no effective response. Jonas declined to testify in his own defense, a decision that sealed his fate as thoroughly as the evidence already had. Deliberations lasted 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of attempted murder with premeditation, guilty of fraud, guilty of illegal transportation and use of toxic substances. Judge Ahmed bin Hassan delivered the sentence with words chosen to reflect the calculated cruelty of Jonas's crime. "Mr. Schneider, you exploited the trust of a vulnerable woman who'd suffered tremendous loss and was brave enough to love again. You planned her murder for months, purchased poison specifically to kill her, and administered it on your wedding night when she had every reason to feel safe. The court sentences you to 25 years imprisonment in Dubai Central Jail, followed by permanent deportation. You will also pay full restitution to Ms. Muller for medical expenses and ongoing care needs." Jonas showed no reaction as guards led him from the courtroom back to the cell where he'd spend the next quarter-century. Sophia watched the verdict announcement from Frankfurt, surrounded by Clara and close friends who'd supported her through impossible months of recovery. When the judge said guilty, she cried not from joy, but from exhausted relief that at least justice had been served, even if it couldn't restore what she'd lost. The years that followed were measured in small victories and persistent challenges. Sophia learned to use advanced prosthetics that allowed limited hand functionality and mobility. She returned to architecture, adapting her design process to accommodate her new physical reality. She established a foundation supporting poisoning survivors and advocating for stricter controls on toxic substance sales. But she never married again, never fully trusted romantic love again. The scars Jonas left went deeper than missing limbs, cutting into her ability to believe anyone could truly want her alive rather than seeing her as an obstacle or opportunity. 5 years after the trial, Sophia gave an interview for a documentary about her case. Her final words captured both the devastation and resilience that defined her survival. "Jonas took my hands and my legs, but he didn't take my life. That's what he'll never forgive himself for in that cell. I survived, and every day I choose to keep surviving is another day he has to live knowing his perfect plan failed completely."